I knew something was off the moment I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Wrapped in a modest towel after my shower, I paused to take in the warmth that still clung to my skin. The steam from the hot water softened the harsh lines of the morning, and in that quiet moment, I sensed an intensity in the atmosphere. There was a look in his eyes, a silent intensity, that lingered longer than it should. His name was John, and to everyone, he seemed to be the perfect partner for Linda, my mother. Yet there was an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. John was 23 years older than I was. His salt and pepper hair and strong jaw had earned him admiration, but it was the depth of his piercing blue eyes that unsettled me the most. They spoke of hidden thoughts and guarded secrets. Despite his calm and confident demeanor, I suspected there was more behind those eyes than anyone realized. When Linda left on her week-long business trip, the house felt strangely empty, almost as if it had been waiting for something to change. At first, the small gestures were barely noticeable. A lingering look across the room, a fleeting moment when our eyes met and then quickly averted. I began to notice these silent exchanges during the quiet hours of the day. In the morning, as I prepared for the day ahead, I couldn't help but feel that he was watching me, an observation that brought both a thrill and a sense of foreboding. I dismissed it as my imagination, yet the subtle shift in his expression every time our paths crossed was unmistakable. One morning, I entered the kitchen wearing a comfortable, oversized shirt and shorts. John sat at the table reading the newspaper, a ritual he never seemed to break. But I could tell something was different. His hands trembled slightly as he sipped his coffee, and his eyes avoided mine. I wondered if he was battling inner turmoil or if he was simply trying to maintain a facade. My thoughts swirled around that quiet, perplexing tension. As the days passed, the unspoken energy between us grew. It wasn't overt, no dramatic declarations or heated arguments, but rather a slow-burning curiosity that neither dared to fully acknowledge. I started to arrange my days to catch a glimpse of him in moments when he wasn't expecting company. I invited Clara, my closest friend, over for an afternoon by the pool. While we chatted and laughed under the summer sun, I couldn't help but notice John's silhouette in the kitchen window. He seemed to pause in his tasks as if drawn to the scene outside, though I couldn't tell if his interest was genuine or simply a habit of solitude. Later that afternoon, when Clara stepped inside to retrieve something, I followed her at a distance. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was merely curious to see if his behavior would change with another presence in the house. In the kitchen, with him quietly preparing a drink, I attempted a casual remark. "Enjoying the view?" I said in a low tone, trying to be playful. His response was terse. "Be careful. You don't know what you're doing." There was no anger in his voice, only a note of caution that made my heart race. In that moment, I realized our unspoken game was as much about testing boundaries as it was about understanding ourselves. That evening, after Clara had left, the house settled into a hush that felt both peaceful and unsettling. I waited until I was sure John had retired to his room before I ventured closer. The hallway was dimly lit, and every step I took seemed to echo my own uncertainty. Standing outside his door, I listened to the quiet sounds from within, a muted rustling, the occasional shift of movement. Summoning my courage, I knocked softly. "John?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. After a pause, the door opened a crack, revealing his concerned face. "I can't sleep," he murmured. His tone was controlled, but the fatigue and restraint in his eyes were evident. I hesitated for a moment before replying. "May I come in?" The question hung between us as I stepped into the quiet room. We stood there in silence, the air heavy with unspoken questions. It was clear that both of us were aware that something had shifted in the boundaries of our relationship, boundaries that were not meant to be crossed. I chose my words carefully, determined to keep the conversation civil. "Perhaps we could talk," I suggested, striving for a tone that was both sincere and non-confrontational. John's gaze remained fixed on a spot in the room, and after a long moment, he simply replied, "It's late. You should go back to bed." His words were measured, but they carried the weight of an unspoken conflict that neither of us was ready to resolve. I left the room with a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. In the quiet moments that followed, I replayed our exchange in my mind, wondering if there was ever a chance for us to bridge the gap that had opened between us. There was an undeniable connection, one that was both forbidden and painful in its complexity. The next morning, life continued with the semblance of normalcy. John sat at the table, going through his routine, while I tried to maintain a calm exterior. Yet every time our eyes met, briefly and then quickly averted, I felt the undercurrent of tension. It was as if the air between us was charged with a secret that neither of us could openly acknowledge. I busied myself with small tasks, all the while aware of the silent presence that had become a part of my daily life. As the week progressed, the burden of the unspoken began to grow heavier. I found myself struggling with conflicting emotions, a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and the undeniable pull of a connection that was as confusing as it was profound. I began to wonder if this tension was merely the result of isolation in an empty house, or if it was something deeper, a reflection of desires that were hidden beneath the surface. While I cherished the quiet moments of introspection, I also felt the need to distance myself from the growing emotional turmoil. I focused on small, everyday tasks and sought solace in the familiarity of routines. Yet the memory of that conversation lingered, a reminder that sometimes the most significant battles are fought within ourselves. In the silent corridors of the house, every creak and distant sound served as a reminder of the choices we had made, and the choices that still lay ahead. I was caught between the comfort of routine and the unpredictable nature of human emotion. John's presence was a constant reminder that life was never as simple as it seemed. As night fell on the first part of this unfolding chapter, I lay awake, contemplating the delicate balance between duty and desire, propriety and rebellion. It was a balance that felt impossible to maintain, a precarious line drawn in the soft shadows of a house filled with secrets. And while I did not know where this journey would ultimately lead, I understood that every choice, every look, and every silent word was a step toward a future that was both uncertain and inevitable. The following days passed with an intensity that was both unnerving and strangely magnetic. Despite our best efforts to maintain the facade of normalcy, every glance and every unintentional pause deepened the silent gulf between us. I found myself oscillating between guilt and curiosity, caught in the midst of a conflict that felt entirely beyond my control. Mornings became a series of quiet rituals. John would sit at the table with his newspaper, his expression distant and guarded. I would attempt to keep to my routines, yet every small detail, the soft hum of the coffee maker, the rustle of the newspaper turning pages, seemed charged with a meaning I couldn't decipher. I began to notice how his hands, though steady in their movements, would occasionally betray a slight tremor, as if the weight of his hidden thoughts pressed upon him more heavily with each passing day. During the afternoons, I tried to fill the emptiness with work and simple distractions. I often retreated to my room with a book or took walks in the nearby park, hoping that the natural calmness would help me untangle the chaotic mixture of emotions that had taken root. However, even in the serenity of nature, I couldn't shake the feeling that John's presence lingered like a shadow, a silent reminder of the secret that bound us together. One particularly warm afternoon, as the sunlight slanted softly through the window, I decided to prepare lunch in the kitchen. The room was bathed in a gentle glow, and for a moment, the ordinary act of chopping vegetables felt like a quiet rebellion against the turmoil inside. As I stirred a pot of soup on the stove, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor, a sound that always set my heart racing. I glanced toward the door and caught sight of John leaning against the frame, his eyes distant yet searching. "Would you like some tea?" I offered, my voice steady despite the rapid beat of my pulse. He paused before responding, his eyes briefly meeting mine, and then he gave a curt nod. "That would be nice," he replied quietly. The air between us was laden with unspoken words, a tension that both of us seemed to understand without needing to articulate it. We sat together at the table, sharing a silence that was at once comfortable and charged with uncertainty. I watched him carefully, noting the way he fiddled with the handle of his teacup, the subtle crease of worry on his brow. There was an entire universe in the silence, a conversation that was spoken in glances and subtle shifts of posture. It was then that I realized the cost of the secret we were both carrying. The weight of our hidden connection seemed to press down on the room, obscuring the simple pleasure of an ordinary afternoon. That evening, after dinner, I found myself restless and unable to sleep. The events of the day played in my mind like a looping film, each minute punctuated by a word left unsaid or a look that held 1,000 questions. I sat by the window in my dimly lit room, watching the shadows lengthen as dusk turned to night. Outside, the world carried on obliviously, yet inside, every heartbeat reminded me of the inescapable tension between us. I recalled our brief conversation over tea, how his eyes had momentarily softened as if burdened by regret or longing. In those fleeting seconds, I sensed that he was wrestling with his own demons, caught between the expectations of his role and a desire that was both dangerous and irresistible. The thought comforted me in a strange way, even as it filled me with apprehension. I knew then that neither of us had truly been free. Both of us were prisoners of our own unspoken yearnings. The next day, determined to break the cycle of silence, I resolved to create an environment where honesty might finally prevail. I arranged for a quiet afternoon in the living room, where the soft background music and the low hum of conversation with Clara, who had come by to keep me company, could perhaps coax John out of his shell. Clara had a way of diffusing tension with her warm laughter and gentle observations. For a time, the atmosphere lightened, and it seemed as though the heavy cloud of unspoken tension might dissipate. Yet, as the day drew to a close, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent that pulsed beneath every interaction. Clara's presence, though refreshing, did little to alleviate the profound conflict simmering in my heart. I watched John carefully, noting the way he avoided my gaze even as his eyes betrayed a glimmer of conflict. His discomfort was palpable, and I sensed that the boundaries we had tacitly agreed upon were beginning to crumble. Later that evening, while Clara was occupied in another room, I found myself alone with John in the quiet of the hallway. The space between us was charged with an electricity that was both terrifying and magnetic. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had left. "John," I began softly, "can we talk about what's happening between us?" My words were tentative, a fragile bridge stretched across a chasm of unexpressed emotions. He hesitated, his eyes darting away before returning to meet mine. "I don't think there's anything to talk about," he said, his tone firm yet laced with a vulnerability that was hard to ignore. "But don't you feel it?" I pressed, trying to maintain a balance between earnest inquiry and restraint. "There's something here, a connection that goes beyond what we're meant to share." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, almost imperceptibly, John's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his own emotions was too much to bear. "I do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it isn't something we can discuss, not yet." His words were a quiet confession, a release of tension that had been building for far too long. And in that admission, I sensed both a promise and a warning, a reminder that our journey was only just beginning, and that the path ahead would be fraught with difficult choices. In the days that followed, the unresolved conversation hung over us like a fragile truce. There were moments when our eyes would meet in passing, and in those brief instants, I could almost read the depths of his conflicted soul. I found solace in writing down my thoughts, capturing the inner dialogue that echoed through my mind in the quiet moments of solitude. The pages of my journal became a refuge, a place where the complexity of my feelings could be untangled without judgment. Yet, the more I wrote, the more I realized how entangled our lives had become. The connection between us was no longer confined to fleeting glances or whispered conversations. It had woven itself into the very fabric of our daily existence. Every shared silence, every accidental touch, carried with it the potential for both profound understanding and heartbreaking regret. At times, I wondered if the tension was an inevitable consequence of the roles we played in each other's lives. John was meant to be a responsible, composed figure, a pillar of stability for Linda and a trusted companion in the public eye. And I was, by all appearances, the dutiful daughter, the one who never strayed from the expected path. Yet, beneath the surface, there existed a tumultuous current of emotions that defied the neat categories of duty and desire. As I navigated this delicate balance, I became increasingly aware that our secret could not remain hidden forever. Every passing day was a step closer to an inevitable reckoning, a moment when the weight of our unspoken desires would demand expression. The quiet tension that had defined our interactions was gradually transforming into something more pronounced, a force that threatened to upend the carefully constructed order of our lives. That night, as I lay in bed with the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the window, I reflected on the path we had taken. The silence between us was no longer an empty void. It had become a powerful presence, shaping every moment and every decision. I wondered if we were destined to continue this dance of hidden emotions, forever teetering on the edge of revelation and restraint. In the end, I understood that some secrets are too heavy to bear alone. While our interactions remained shrouded in quiet complexity, I knew that the next chapter in our lives would force us to confront the truth that had been building between us. The unspoken promise of change hung in the air, a silent testament to the fact that every choice had its price, and that our journey, however fraught with peril, was drawing us inexorably toward an uncertain future. As the first part of this uncharted chapter closed, I realized that the true test lay ahead, one that would require not only courage but also the willingness to accept the consequences of our hidden desires. And though the path forward was uncertain, I was determined to face it, come what may. In the days that followed our quiet conversation in the hallway, The tension between John and me deepened to an almost unbearable level. Every moment of silence felt charged with meaning, as if the air itself had taken on the weight of our unspoken truths. I began to sense that our fragile truce was nearing its breaking point, a moment when the delicate balance between duty and desire would finally shatter. Mornings turned into an unspoken ritual. John continued his quiet routine, sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper with an expression that betrayed inner turmoil, while I moved through my day with a growing sense of urgency. Every shared glance, however fleeting, carried a mix of regret and determination. It was as if we both knew that our secret could no longer remain hidden behind half-formed words and tentative actions. One particularly crisp morning, I found myself in the living room, watching John from across the room as he tried to concentrate on a book. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the tension etched in his face. I recalled our recent conversation, where his soft admission of feeling something forbidden had resonated with me, and yet he insisted that it was not yet the time to discuss it further. The unresolved questions began to gnaw at me. How much longer could we both continue to live under the shadow of this mutual disquiet? Later that day, Clara visited again. Her presence brought a brief reprieve from the charged atmosphere. Over cups of herbal tea, she gently prodded me about the changes she'd noticed in the household. "You seem different lately," she observed kindly, unaware of the delicate undercurrents swirling around us. I managed a half-smile, replying that I was merely more introspective. Still, as she chatted, I could sense her careful eyes drifting towards John, who sat in the adjoining room with a pained expression. The unspoken acknowledgement of our shared secret weighed heavily on all of us. In the evening, with Linda's return looming and the threat of exposure growing ever nearer, I felt compelled to address the situation head-on. The night was cool and quiet when I found John alone in the study, a room filled with muted lamplight and the scent of old books. I hesitated at the doorway, my heart pounding with the knowledge that this conversation could change everything. "John," I began softly, stepping into the room as if drawn by an irresistible force. His eyes met mine, vulnerable yet guarded, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said, "I can't continue like this, pretending that nothing has changed. We both know there's something between us, a conflict that we must confront." His face tightened, and he looked away for several long seconds before answering in a voice barely above a whisper, "I know. I've been fighting it for so long, but I don't know how to stop these feelings." I approached him slowly, determined yet gentle. "It's not about stopping the feelings," I replied. "It's about understanding them and deciding what we truly want for our futures. We cannot keep living in this ambiguous space where every moment is filled with tension and regret." His eyes, now moist with unspoken sorrow, searched mine for an answer. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Before I could reply, the distant sound of keys jangling and footsteps approaching reminded us that the fragile veil of secrecy could be torn away at any moment. The return of Linda was imminent. I knew that if we did not act quickly, the carefully built facade would crumble, leaving us exposed and vulnerable to consequences we could not control. In that charged moment, I resolved that we must redefine our relationship in a way that restored balance and propriety, one that respected the boundaries of our lives while acknowledging the depth of our emotions. "John," I said firmly, "we need to find a way to talk, to seek help if necessary, so that we can resolve what has been festering between us. We must choose honesty over this silent suffering." His eyes glistened with a mix of relief and despair. "I'm scared," he admitted, "but I don't want to lose what we have, even if it's as complicated as it is." As the night deepened and the approaching footsteps grew louder, the moment took on an air of finality. We agreed to postpone a detailed discussion until a safer time, a time when Linda's presence would no longer threaten to expose our vulnerabilities. In that brief interval, we embraced the unspoken promise of change, knowing that the forthcoming days would force us to confront our feelings with clarity and resolve. The study door clicked shut behind me as I left John to his solitude, my heart heavy yet strangely hopeful. I knew that the path ahead would be fraught with difficult choices and inevitable consequences, but also that the tipping point had been reached. Our lives, tangled in secrecy and conflicted desires, were now on the brink of transformation, and in that precarious balance, I could no longer hide from the truth. The following morning, the inevitable confrontation unfolded. Linda had discovered the secret correspondence between John and me, and the air in the house grew heavy with the threat of exposure. The calm routine shattered as Linda confronted us in the quiet kitchen. Her eyes, filled with hurt and disbelief, pierced through the tension that had built over weeks. "I trusted you both," she said, her voice wavering between anger and sorrow. John stood there, his posture defeated, while I felt a profound mix of regret and responsibility for the breach of trust. In that charged moment, we realized that our silent game had spiraled far beyond the boundaries of propriety. There was no escaping the consequences of our choices. We had allowed our unspoken desires to blur the lines of our familial bonds, and now the price was being exacted. I took a tentative step forward, my voice soft yet resolute. I never meant to hurt you, Linda. We lost ourselves in confusion and failed to see what was right. John's eyes mirrored the same regret as he mumbled his apology. Though their words fell short of mending the broken trust, they marked the beginning of an honest reckoning. Linda's expression softened slightly, but the hurt remained evident. You must both seek help to understand and heal from this, she declared. It was a stark ultimatum, a call for accountability and change. In that moment, it became clear that our journey toward reconciliation would be long and painful, yet necessary for the sake of our family's integrity. As Linda retreated to her room, John and I remained in the silent aftermath, burdened by the irreversible impact of our choices. We resolved to confront our inner conflicts openly and pursue professional guidance, understanding that only through truth and accountability could we hope to mend what was broken. In the finality of that day, the heavy silence of the house signaled both an end and the cautious beginning of healing. The reckoning had arrived, and with it, the promise of rebuilding trust from the fragments of our shared mistakes.